Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Monday, 27 May 2024. It is the 692nd anniversary of the birth of Abū Zayd Abd ar-Raḥmān ibn Muḥammad ibn Khaldūn al-Ḥaḍramī, better known to posterity as Ibn Khaldun, who was born in Tunis under the Hafsid Sultanate on this date in 1332 AD. His dates in the Islamic lunar calendar were 732 to 808 of the Hejira Era. So even though he was born in Tunisia, his family was from Andalusia, but they had been displaced by the Reconquista, and so they resettled in Tunis. So Ibn Khaldun was a Tunisian Arabic philosopher and historian who wrote a singular treatise, the Maqqadimmah, which discusses politics, history, sociology, philosophy of history, and a lot of related problems. A contemporary philosopher of history, Hayden White, wrote of Ibn Khaldun, quote, "Readers of Toynbee's study will know that Ibn Khaldun has been acclaimed as the producer of the greatest work of its kind that has ever been created by any mind in any time or place. Toynbee enshrines Ibn Khaldun in a pantheon which houses Herodotus, Thucydides, Polybius, Josephus, St. Augustine, Gibbon, and Turgot. And of that group, Ibn Khaldun seems, at least at first glance, the most modern of all. Evidence of his modernity is reflected in the dispute between historians and sociologists for the honor of claiming him as their own," unquote. White is correct that historians and sociologists have sought to claim Ibn Khaldun as their own, but he further notes, quote, "Ibn Khaldun cannot be classified with either historian or sociologist with any sort of terminological accuracy," unquote. So here's some of Toynbee's fulsome praise for Ibn Khaldun, which includes the bit quoted by White. Quote, "In his chosen field of intellectual activity, he appears to have been inspired by no predecessors, and to have found no kindred souls among his contemporaries, and to have kindled no answering spark of inspiration in any successors. And yet, in the prolegomena, Muqaddimah, to his universal history, he has conceived and formulated a philosophy of history which is undoubtedly the greatest work of its kind that has ever yet been created by any mind in any time or place," unquote. Ibn Khaldun's great book is the Muqaddimah, which means prolegomena, which means that it was intended as an introduction to the study of history, sort of like Jean Baudin's method for the easy comprehension of history. Some call the Muqaddimah a history, some call it a work of historiography, some, like Toynbee, call it a philosophy of history, and some have called it the first work of sociology. It could be said that the Muqaddimah contains elements of all of these. We're probably best off sticking with Ibn Khaldun's original intention, which is that it is an introduction to history rather than history itself. This sense of being an introduction to the study of the history comes out clearly in an early passage from the Muqaddimah. Quote, "The writing of history requires numerous sources and greatly varied knowledge. It also requires a good speculative mind and thoroughness. Possession of these two qualities leads the historian to the truth and keeps him from slips and errors. If he trusts historical information in its plain transmitted form and has no clear knowledge of the principles of resulting from custom, the fundamental facts of politics, the nature of civilization, or the conditions governing human social organization, and if, furthermore, he does not evaluate remote or ancient material through the comparison with near or contemporary material, he often cannot avoid stumbling and slipping and deviating from the high road of truth," unquote. So even as an introduction to history, the Muqaddimah belongs to a number of unclassifiable works that touch on many aspects of human life and experience. Unclassifiable books are difficult to assimilate. We don't really have the conceptual framework for it. And the Muqaddimah presents additional problems for us. We've all have difficulty understanding a work written in a fundamentally different historical era with its alien presuppositions. And for Westerners as well, there is the difficulty of reading a work conceived within a distinct civilization. But these barriers can be overcome. The Islamic Golden Age is in some respects less alien to us than the European Middle Ages, since it is, like ourselves today and like classical antiquity, a time of cosmopolitanism, of aspirations to universality, of plenty, and of routine travel. We can read writers like Ibn Khaldun, Ibn Fadlan, and Ibn Battuta as though they were contemporaries, whereas the works of Wolfram von Eschenbach and Gottfried von Strassburg strike us as strange, even when we find in them much that is familiar. Perhaps the virtue of being readable to posterity comes at the cost of being alienated from one's own time. Barbara Stowesser wrote of Ibn Khaldun in her paper, Ibn Khaldun's Philosophy of History, The Rise and Fall of States and Civilizations, quote, Ibn Khaldun's ideas were in some ways too realistic and hence revolutionary for the intellectually stagnant society in which he lived and worked. There is very little evidence that he had any impact on Arab thought in the late 14th or early 15th centuries. It was only in the 16th and particularly in the 17th centuries that an Ibn Khaldun rediscovery got underway, and the people who rediscovered and read and commented upon him were the Ottoman Turks. The Ottomans, as you know, concentrated much of their intellectual interest upon history and political thought, and they were fascinated with Ibn Khaldun. In the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, the study of Ibn Khaldun constituted an important segment of Turkish intellectual history. It was only in the 19th century that Europe joined the Turks in reading Ibn Khaldun, unquote. It is then the fate of many substantive thinkers to be unappreciated in their own time. And we know that no prophet is accepted in his own country, just as we know that the past is a foreign country. And we could add to that that the future is a foreign country to the past. So therein lies the rub. Later generations are arguably less well-equipped to appreciate a work and neglect it in its own time, being further removed from the lived experience that was the inspiration of that work. Also, we project our own concerns into a past innocent of the world that we take for granted today. To a certain extent, this is, of course, unavoidable. Most of the terminology we have today for discussing historiography and philosophy of history did not yet exist for Ibn Khaldun, so in order to see the relevance of his work, we often have to translate his ideas into a modern idiom, and there are certain hazards in doing so. That's why Hayden White wrote that Ibn Khaldun can't be called an historian or a sociologist with any terminological accuracy. But what about conceptual accuracy? Say we agree that Ibn Khaldun is not an historian in the modern sense of the term. How then is he to be mapped onto the conceptual space of history? I would argue that the hazards increase as we approach foundational concepts, and it is the nature of a work like the Muqaddimah to engage with foundational concepts. The idea of history is itself a foundational concept, as is the idea of knowledge and science and so on. When we read chapter 6 of the Maqqadimmah, we find a catalog of knowledge or of the sciences that sets alchemy next to logic and Sufism next to dream interpretation, which in the modern mind seem like category errors. In this sense, Ibn Khaldun reads more like St. Thomas Aquinas than a contemporary. If we want to extract from the Maqqadimmah the perennial lessons it has to teach, we have to take it out of the context in which it was formulated. Its context is a world now lost to us, which can only be recovered with great difficulty. Part of this difficulty, for example, is that there is a lot in the Maqqadimmah about magic, divination, and sorcery. Take the following, for instance. Quote, in the Gaia, Maslama mentioned that when a human being is placed in a barrel of sesame oil and kept in it for 40 days, is fed with figs and nuts until his flesh is gone and only the arteries and the sutures of the skull remain, and is then taken out of the oil and exposed to the drying action of the air, he will answer all special and general questions regarding the future that may be asked. This is detestable sorcery. However, it shows what remarkable things exist in the world of man, unquote. That is from the 6th prefatory discussion to chapter 2. It's worth observing that this is a falsifiable methodology, but it is unlikely to have been tried a number of times sufficient to get statistically significant confirmatory or disconfirmatory evidence. I do wonder how many readers of the Maslama did actually attempt this, if any. On the one hand, Ibn Khaldun seems to credit this sorcery as being possibly efficacious. On the other hand, his scientific detachment is evident from his final remark. He notes that this is detestable, but it remains interesting as testimony to the remarkable things we find in the world of man. And we do find remarkable things in the world, and Ibn Khaldun is absolutely right about that. I suspect that the scientifically detached Ibn Khaldun would have been ready to discuss the possibility of confirmatory or disconfirmatory evidence for sorcery. It is this scientifically detached Ibn Khaldun that we must extract from the intellectual and cultural context in which sorcery is commonplace. While we do an author a certain degree of violence by thus extracting his ideas from their human, all too human context, it's not all that unusual. Reading St. Augustine is not all that different. There is much that I have extracted from St. Augustine that I find to be of value, despite his many digressions to profess his faith. Augustine, too, like Ibn Khaldun, is interested in divination and demonology, and since we don't much credit this today, we tend to gloss over these sections, although they were a large part of Augustine's world, as they were also a large part of Ibn Khaldun's world. Should we sacrifice this world with all its peculiarities in order to derive the perennial lessons, or do we keep Ibn Khaldun or St. Augustine whole and intact, treating them as mere historical figures whose work no longer bears upon the world? I touched on this previously in my episode on J.G.A. Pocock and contextualism, since the context of Ibn Khaldun's work is almost unrecoverable to us, and I said that we have to strip away this context in order to get at what is perennially true in the book. What do we have if we don't strip away the unfamiliar context? Robert Irwin, in his book Ibn Khaldun, An Intellectual Biography, had this to say, quote, "It is precisely Ibn Khaldun's irrelevance to the modern world that makes him so interesting and important. When I read the Maqqadimmah, I have the sense that I am encountering a visitor from another planet, and that is exciting. There have been other ways of looking at the world than the one we mostly take for granted today," unquote. Some years, a correspondent said something very similar to this to me, saying that Ibn Khaldun had described a world that no longer exists, and it took him some time to become fully cognizant of this. That his sociology and history isn't universal; that it's describing a particular milieu that is no longer with us. As such, we could say that this work belongs to historical sociology, but that isn't an adequate way to understand the Muqaddimah. Understanding the book in the fullness of its historical, social, and cultural context alienate the work from us and our concerns, and this meaning can only be recovered by means of the patient contextual methods pursued by Pocock and others of the contextualist school. Despite this strangeness, there are moments within the Muqaddimah when Ibn Khaldun seems to affirm the categories of our thought, and his argument makes perfect sense to us. For example, quote, "People who grow up in villages and uncivilized, thinly populated cities, and who have an innate desire for scientific activity, cannot find scientific instruction in these places. For scientific instruction is something technical, and there are no crafts among the inhabitants of the desert, as we have stated before. These people, therefore, must travel and seek scientific instruction in cities where civilization is highly developed, as is the case with all crafts," unquote. This passage highlights a theme that runs throughout Ibn Khaldun, and that is the contrast between sedentary life in cities and the nomadic life of the Bedouin in the desert. As we can see from the previous quote, Ibn Khaldun gives cities their full measure of relevance, acknowledging that craft specialization is only to be found in cities, but he also sees the problems with urban life, which are distinct from those of the village and the desert. He makes some interesting observations on urban juvenile delinquency. Quote, "The city then teems with low people of blameworthy character. They encounter competition from many members of the younger generation of the dynasty, whose education has been neglected and whom the dynasty has neglected to accept. They, therefore, adopt the qualities of their environment and company, even though they may be people of noble descent and ancestry. Men are human beings, and as such resemble one another. They differ in merit and are distinguished by their character, by their acquisition of virtues and avoidance of vices. The person who is strongly colored by any kind of vice and whose good character is corrupted is not helped by his good descent and fine origin. Thus, one finds that many descendants of great families, men of highly esteemed origin, members of the dynasty, get into deep water and adopt low occupations in order to make a living because their character is corrupt and they are colored by wrongdoing and insincerity. If this situation spreads in a town or nation, God permits it to be ruined and destroyed. This is the meaning of the word of God. When we want to destroy a village, we order those of its inhabitants who live in luxury to act wickedly therein. Thus the word becomes true for it, and we do destroy it." Unquote. For Ibn Khaldun, then, civilization and its cities are a mixed blessing at best. And while the Bedouin of the desert do not possess craft specialization, they are also free of the vices and luxury of urban life. And this is a perennial theme that we find in almost all writings of all civilizations. Ibn Khaldun also discussed this contrast as it touches upon the law. Quote, "When laws are enforced by means of punishment, they completely destroy fortitude, because the use of punishment against someone who cannot defend himself generates in that person a feeling of humiliation that, no doubt, must break his fortitude. When laws are intended to serve the purposes of education and instruction and are applied from childhood on, they have to some degree the same effect, because people then grow up in fear and docility and consequently do not rely on their own fortitude. For this reason, greater fortitude is found among the savage Arab Bedouins than among people who are subject to laws. Furthermore, those who rely on laws and are dominated by them from the very beginning of their education and instruction in the crafts, sciences, and religious matters are thereby deprived of much of their own fortitude. They can scarcely defend themselves at all against hostile acts. This is the case with students whose occupation it is to study and to learn from teachers and religious leaders, and who constantly apply themselves to instruction and education in these very dignified gatherings. This situation and the fact that it destroys the power of resistance and fortitude must be understood." Unquote. And I agree, it must be understood to understand how society functions. And one can see in passages like this why many have identified Ibn Khaldun as a sociologist or a theoretician of culture, though I would say that it's equally true that as an introduction to history, we need to understand these things in order to understand how and why history functions as it does. In Muhsin Muadi's book-length study, Ibn Khaldun's Philosophy of History, a study in the philosophic foundations of a science of culture, Muadi characterizes Ibn Khaldun's effort as being toward a science of culture. He finishes off his book taking a swipe at Hegelian philosophies of history. Quote, "Ibn Khaldun did not turn to history to find his standards and goal, or to see how the idea progressively realizes itself and learn its future course so that he could join the predetermined course of history. For him, future action cannot be determined by any science. It continues to be the product of an art which requires a knowledge of the end of man and society, and the knowledge of the actual circumstances supplied by history, but which must be perfected through experience. Having equipped himself with such knowledge, it remains the responsibility of the wise man to decide what is best under particular circumstances. He is not relieved of the task of making right choices. History, even when ascertained and explained in the light of the new science of culture, may help the wise man to make a better choice, but it does not and cannot choose for him." Unquote. I suspect that many people would agree with this, whether or not they have read Ibn Khaldun or whether or not they have any interest in philosophy of history. And although Ibn Khaldun did not seek his standards and goals in history, he did understand the importance of understanding history, which is why he wrote the Maqqadimmah, hence the need for an introduction to history. And it's worth reflecting on the idea that an introduction of history might be more difficult than history itself. Insofar as an introduction to history is a guide to the understanding of history, we can see why this is the case, although it seems a little counterintuitive that an introduction should be more difficult than that to which it introduces us. But anyone can memorize names, dates, and places, and anyone can follow a narrative, but understanding what's happening and why it is happening is much more difficult. The Muqaddimah attempts to assist us with this difficulty. And there is a lot in the Maqqadimmah, but when I think about Ibn Khaldun, I keep coming back to the image of the man in the vat of sesame oil. It's a strange image, but I can imagine in my mind's eye, Ibn Khaldun being told about this and hearing about it in his travels, being invited to actually witness this sorcery or something similar to it. I can see the whole thing in flickering lamplight, being led to some hole in the wall in a dingy part of the city, passing the kind of disreputable characters that Ibn Khaldun described inhabiting cities, and then the door opening onto a bizarre scene of a partially dissolved man being decanted from a barrel of oil. I imagine it's like a scene from a Sinbad movie from the 70s, which I enjoyed a great deal at the time. What would Ibn Khaldun have to say about a scene like this? What would he do and how would he respond? For this, I have a little thought experiment. I draw on a historical analogy, which might seem a bit strained, but hear me out. When, as Westerners, we read accounts of the witch craze of the 16th and 17th centuries, we start to get a feel for the relative scope of the rationality of the individuals involved. If you read enough, you go beyond the words and you get a sense of the men who are involved in the situations. The man whose words you read is a man of his time, since we all are, but there were different temperaments then as there are today, and some temperaments are skeptical, some are credulous, some are rational, some are practical. And some of these temperaments are more consistent with what we would today recognize as rationality than others. Some men confronted with witches and spectral evidence were all in on it. And the kind of man who would be all in for a moral panic in the 16th or 17th century is the same kind of man who would be all in for a moral panic in the 21st century. Some men were skeptical, but they were willing to listen, and we know their type today. Some men were pragmatic, uninterested in claims about demons and spirits, and only seeing the situation for what it was in its immediacy. And these two are familiar characters for us. And of course, there are men with an intuitive sense of scientific detachment, sometimes skeptical, sometimes pragmatic, always interested, even if horrified by the situation. I take Ibn Khaldun to be a man like this. So to return to the man in the vat of sesame oil, I think Ibn Khaldun, confronted with the scene, would have been angry about the practice of sorcery, indignant about the treatment of the subject of the experiment, and dismissive of the claims of the sorcerer, who we can imagine in the background waving his hands and protesting how he has an explanation for everything. Just change a few details in the stories and it could be any of us today. I've seen some strange things in my time. Nothing is strange about Ibn Khaldun describes, but strange enough that it made me wonder. So here I think we find our connection to Ibn Khaldun and the Maqqadimmah. Circumstances change, but men are what they are in every age. This is the introduction to history that we need to understand this, but it's not the introduction to history we usually get. And this is part of what makes the Maqqadimmah both difficult and interesting. It is unfamiliar to us, but it is a necessary unfamiliarity. So happy birthday, Ibn Khaldun, and thanks for listening.